Hey guys, and welcome back. After learning about the find view by ID, it's time to move to the view binding and see how it's more efficient and it's more useful than using the find view by ID. So view binding, as the name suggests, it binds data to your views. It works by generating a class that resembles your layout. The class includes attributes, and each of these attributes represent all of your views. All you have to do is to create an instance of that class. Then you can access those attributes, and therefore you will have access to your views. The view binding is very flexible, unlike the find view by ID, as you don't have to create a variable for each view that you add to your views or to your layout. Similarly, you don't have to remove any variable that points to a view that doesn't exist anymore in your layout. View binding setup in activities is usually fixed, and it's under 3 steps. First, you'll have to create an instance variable within your activity of the binding type. Then you have to initialize the binding within your onCreate class, as you want to initialize this variable once, so the onCreate is the suitable function to create this object. One thing to keep in mind is that you should always initialize it after the supercall, as initializing before the supercall will most probably lead to crashes in your application. Finally, you will set the argument within the setContentView function to the binding.root, and the root here is the variable that represents the whole layout. Now, let's see this in action. Back to our main activity, we will learn about the view binding by converting this code here, or the find view by ID code, to the view binding. So the view binding is not included by default in your normal projects. You have to add the dependency or the library for that view within the Gradle script file. So if you are viewing this hierarchy in the Android view, you have to go to the Gradle scripts, then the module Gradle file here. And if you're not, if you're for example viewing in the project view, then you have to go to the app, then the build.gradle within the app module here. Let's go back to the Android, and we are going to click on the build.gradle. And here, make sure you are within the Android block to add the view binding. So I'm just, for example, going to add the last thing here within the block. So there are 2 ways to add the view binding. First one is to add it within something called build features. Then you type view binding and make it true. Alternatively, you could just have to add view binding and then open the block and then write enabled and then just add true here. Both will work, choose whatever suits you. So for me, I'm just going to delete the build features. I'm going to keep this one and click on sync now. And now you have to wait for the project to include the library to your project. Once it's done, go back to your main activity. And now let's follow the steps that we have discussed before. So the first thing is to create an instance variable of our binding type. So here, I'm just going to call it binding. It's going to be private because we are not going to use it outside of this class. Private late init var because we are going to initialize it later after the supercall. I'm going to call it binding, and here is going to be of the type activity main binding. And you can notice that the binding class here follows the name of your activity or your activity main layout. You can see here that it's called activity main, follows the name of the layout, then it follows by the binding. So this is the class that the view binding generated for you, and it's the class that resembles or represents your layout. So once we create this instance, we have to initialize it just after the supercall. Remember, after the supercall, binding is equal to activity main binding dot inflate. Then we pass the layout inflator. So inflate here is responsible to inflate your view. Inflating means, or inflation means, to make your view or make your layout visible to the user. So it's similar to the balloon inflator, which makes the balloon more visible and more evident to the observer. And here the layout inflator is the class that is responsible to inflate your layouts. So we pass it to the inflate method. Finally, and the last step is to change the setContentView argument from the layout here to binding.root. And you can see here, once you press Ctrl and left click on the root, take you to your layout here, so the whole layout. So now the root resembles your layout. Finally, we are going to replace all of these views or all of these variables with the binding. As you can see here, once you type binding followed by a dot, you see here that the binding or the view binding created an attribute. Each attribute resembles your views. So you can see here the first number ET, the result ET, calculate button from the last video, and second number ET. So now let's just delete all the variables of the find view by ID. And now let's fix these errors. So instead of the button, I'm going to say binding.button. And I think it's called calculate button. And here binding dot first number ET. And for this one, binding dot second number ET. And finally, for the result, binding dot result EV. And now let's run our application to test the changes. Once the application is run, you can just try it out. Works as before. You can see how the view binding simplifies the process of accessing views within our code and have reference to our views within our code. You can see in these two pictures here shown on screen how we save a lot of code and how we got rid of a lot of boilerplate code or useless code that we write more often. So it's always recommended to use the view binding rather than find view by ID function, as the view binding offers null safety and type safety for our views. So if we, for example, here come and create a variable called button and then initialize it to find view by ID, and then instead of giving the value or the type of this view to button, for example, we would mistakenly give it a text view here. And then for the ID, we, for example, would give something that doesn't belong to our layout. In this case, text1, which doesn't belong to our layout. You can see here, this code here or this line of code here has a lot of mess. First thing, it says it's a button, and then it says it's of type text view. And finally, the ID here doesn't belong to our layout. So that's why it's recommended to use the view binding rather than the find view by ID. So that was it for this video. Thank you for watching, and I see you in the next video.